Rain hammered the glass of the Royal York's revolving doors, and Hazel Brennan counted her steps the way she always did in unfamiliar buildings. 14 from the curb to the threshold, a sharp left, then the long marble run toward the sound of a string trio she could just make out over the storm. She wasn't blind. She wasn't deaf, not technically. What Hazel had was rarer and, in its own cruel way, lonelier. A condition called Susak syndrome that had eaten away at the hearing in her left ear and scattered blank patches across the edges of her vision, like someone had taken an eraser to the corners of the world. Doctors called it manageable. Hazel called it a slow theft. She compensated the way she'd learned to compensate for everything in her 26 years, by working twice as hard to look like nothing was wrong. Tonight, that meant getting to her cousin's engagement party at the Royal York without anyone, noticing she'd had to follow the wall the last 30 feet because her depth perception had quietly betrayed her in the rain. She didn't notice the men in dark suits until she was already inside their perimeter. 6 of them, she'd learn later. Tall, economical with their movements, positioned around a man descending the grand staircase with the unhurried confidence of someone who had never once in his life worried about being late. Hazel saw none of this. She saw blur and motion at the edges, heard the murmur of expensive shoes on stone, and kept walking toward the warmth and the music because that was what her body told her to do. She didn't see the man step off the last stair directly into her path. The collision wasn't violent. It was the kind of stumble that happens 100 times a day in a crowded hotel lobby, except that the chest she slammed into didn't move an inch, and the silence that followed was the wrong kind of silence, too total, too immediate. Hands where I can see them. A voice, low, sharp as a blade unsheathing. Hazel heard fabric shift. 6 men, she'd realize. 6 men reaching for something under their jackets, and her stomach dropped through the floor. "I'm sorry," she said, too fast, her hands already up, palms out. The universal language of "I am not a threat. Please don't hurt me. I didn't see you. I have a vision thing. I wasn't. Stand down." The first voice again, except now it was different, quieter. Closer. A hand closed around her wrist. Not rough, not yet, just firm enough to anchor her, and she felt him turn her slightly toward whatever light was strongest in that direction, the way you'd turn someone's face to check for a bruise. She felt his attention land on her like a weight, on her cheek, on the faint, thin scar that ran from her temple to the edge of her jaw, the one she usually covered with her hair, the one that had come loose in the wind outside. He went very, very still. "Marcus," he said, not to her. "Stand the men down." "Sir, we don't know who." I said stand them down. There was nothing raised about his voice, and that was somehow worse than shouting. Hazel heard the unmistakable click of weapons being lowered, holstered, the soft rustle of men stepping back, and only then did the man holding her wrist seem to remember he was still touching her. "You're shaking," he said. "You pointed guns at me. They pointed guns at you. I didn't." A beat. "What's your name?" "Why does that matter? Humor me." She almost didn't answer. Something about the careful, deliberate way he was speaking, like a man choosing each word the way other people chose chess moves, made the hair rise on the back of her neck. But there was also something underneath it, something that sounded almost like disbelief, like he was hearing the answer to a question he'd stopped expecting to ever ask. "Hazel," she said. Hazel Brennan. The silence that followed lasted exactly long enough for her to feel it. "I'm getting you a coat," he said finally, and before she could protest, something heavy and warm and smelling faintly of cedar and gun oil settled over her shoulders. "It's raining. You're soaked through. I have somewhere to be." "Not tonight. You don't." His name was Cassian Bray, and Hazel learned 3 things about him in the back of a car so quiet she could hear her own pulse. That he owned the hotel they'd just left, that the men around him called him boss in a tone usually reserved for things people were afraid of, and that he knew the name Brennan the way other people knew their own birthdays. Instantly, completely, without having to be told twice. "You knew my father," she said. "It wasn't a question. I knew your father very well. He died when I was 16. Heart attack, at his desk." She'd recited this so many times it had worn smooth like a stone in her pocket. He was an actuary. He was a forensic accountant for the Bray organization, Cassian said, and something in his careful, level voice cracked just slightly on the word organization. For 11 years he managed the books that kept three families from tearing each other apart over money nobody was supposed to know existed. And he didn't die of a heart attack, Hazel. He was poisoned. Slowly. Over months. By a man named Desmond Lowry, who wanted those books for himself and didn't have the patience to wait for your father to hand them over. The car was very warm and very dark, and Hazel was suddenly aware of how very alone she was with this stranger who spoke about her father's murder the way other people discussed weather. "You're lying. I wish I were. Why are you telling me this now? 10 years later, in the back of a car, after your men pointed guns at me?" Cassian was quiet long enough that she thought he might not answer. When he did, his voice had dropped into something rougher, something that sounded almost human. "Because 3 days ago, Desmond Lowry found out you're alive. He spent a decade assuming your father destroyed everything before he died. He was wrong. And tonight, while you were walking into my hotel in the rain, his men were breaking into your apartment on Bathurst Street." Hazel's whole body went cold. "How do you know where I live?" "Because I've known where you live for 10 years, Cassian said quietly. "I made a promise to your father before he died, that I would watch over you, that whatever happened, you would never know what world he'd really worked in, and you would never be touched by it." He let out a breath that sounded almost like a laugh, except there was no humor in it at all. "I've spent a decade trying to keep that promise. Tonight I failed in the first 5 minutes." The condo was on the 52nd floor of a building Hazel hadn't even known existed, glass on 3 sides, the lights of Toronto spilling out beneath them like something poured rather than built. For 3 days she lived inside it the way you live inside a held breath, fed expensive food she barely tasted, given clothes that fit too well to be coincidence, watched over by a rotating cast of quiet men, who called Cassian boss and called her, with a deference that unsettled her more than hostility would have, Miss Brennan. Cassian himself was a contradiction she couldn't resolve. He was, by every account she overheard through doors not quite closed, a man capable of terrible things. She heard him give an order one evening, flat and final, that made one of his men go pale, and yet every time he was in a room with her, his voice gentled into something almost unbearably careful, like he was handling something he was afraid of breaking. "You don't have to be kind to me," she told him on the second night, when he found her standing at the window with her hand pressed flat against the glass, trying to map the city by the vibration of the wind against 52 floors of steel. "I know what you are." "You know what I do," Cassian said. "You don't know what I am. Is there a difference?" He didn't answer that. Instead, he asked, with a hesitance that didn't match anything else about him, "Does it hurt? The hearing? Losing it?" No one had ever asked her that directly before. People asked around it, asked about treatments and prognosis and whether she needed help, but no one asked if it hurt. "It's like the world keeps getting quieter on one side," she said slowly, surprising herself with the honesty. "Like everyone's slowly moving to my right and I have to keep turning to find them." Cassian was silent for a long moment. "Your father used to say you played the cello like you could hear colors. He kept a recording on his phone. I still have it." Something in Hazel's chest cracked open that she'd kept sealed for 10 years, and she had to turn back to the window so he wouldn't see her face. On the 4th evening, everything fell apart. A man burst into the penthouse with the kind of urgency that meant something had gone catastrophically wrong. Marcus, the underboss, his voice tight enough to cut glass. "Boss, Lowry's men hit the warehouse on Cherry Street. They've got 4 of ours pinned down. It's a setup, it has to be, but if we don't move, I have to go," Cassian said, already crossing toward the door, already a different person, harder, faster, a man assembling armor as he walked. He stopped in front of Hazel, and for 1 second the hardness slipped. "The penthouse is locked down, nobody gets in. Theo will stay with you." "Who's Theo?" "He works for me. You'll be safe." "Will you be safe?" The question seemed to catch him off guard. He reached out the way he had once or twice before and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, his thumb resting for half a second against the thin scar at her temple. "I've survived worse than Desmond Lowry's idea of a trap," he said, and then he was gone, and the silence of the penthouse closed over her like water. Theo was younger than the others. With a voice Hazel had clocked as wrong from the first 10 seconds, too smooth, too rehearsed, a man performing loyalty rather than living it. He smelled, faintly and incongruously, of spearmint gum layered over something acrid underneath it that Hazel recognized after a moment as fear-sweet. People who were calm didn't smell like that. People who were about to do something terrible did. "So," Theo said, once the elevator had sealed shut 52 floors below them, "the famous Hazel Brennan, sitting on top of a fortune and she doesn't even know it." Hazel didn't move from the window. "Cassian trusts you." "Cassian's an idiot." Theo's voice had shed its softness entirely now, gone sharp and businesslike. 10 years he's been playing guardian angel for a girl who doesn't even know what she's worth. "Desmond Lowry offered me $2 million and a piece of the North End to walk you out of this building tonight. The warehouse fire is a distraction, sweetheart. Cassian's not coming back anytime soon." Hazel's pulse spiked, but she let none of it reach her voice. "I don't know what you think I have. Your father's accounts. Every shell company, every numbered account in the Caymans, every routing number that keeps 3 crime families from killing each other over money. He didn't destroy it before he died. Paranoid men like Thomas Brennan don't destroy leverage. He hid it, and he left it with you." Theo's footsteps moved closer across the hardwood, slow and deliberate, the way a man moves when he thinks he's already won. "You're going to tell me where, or I'm going to make this very unpleasant." What Theo did not know, what almost no one knew, because Hazel had spent a decade making sure of it, was that her father had not raised a victim. He had raised, in the only way he knew how, a survivor. Thomas Brennan had spent the last 2 years of his life teaching his daughter things that made no sense to her at the time. How to read the shift of weight in someone's footsteps. How to find the soft, vulnerable points of a body by feel alone. How to listen to a room the way other people read a map. She'd thought it was grief, his way of compensating for a diagnosis that was stealing pieces of her. She understood now it had been preparation. He'd known, even then, that the world he'd hidden her from might someday come looking. "It's not in a file," Hazel said, and let her voice drop, very quietly, into something that was no longer afraid. "It was never in a file." Theo paused. "What?" "My father composed a piece for solo cello when I was 14. He called it Brennan's Lullaby. Every account number, every shell corporation, every routing code. It's encoded in the fingering, the notation. I memorized it before I ever understood what it meant." She turned to face him fully now, and something in her posture had changed entirely, gone still, and coiled and unmistakably dangerous. "I have had 11 years of every account in 3 crime families' empires sitting in my head, Theo. And you walked into a locked room with me and told me your name." Theo lunged. He was fast, but Hazel had spent a decade learning a room by sound, and the rasp of his sleeve against the doorframe gave her his trajectory a full half-second before his hand closed on empty air where her shoulder had been. She pivoted on her back foot, drove her palm up into the soft cartilage beneath his jaw with a force that made his head snap back and his vision white out. And before he could recover, she'd swept his legs from under him with her cane, the one accessibility tool she carried not because she needed it for balance, but because her father had insisted, years ago, that she always have a length of reinforced carbon fiber within reach, just in case. Theo hit the floor hard enough to drive the air from his lungs. By the time he'd blinked the stars from his eyes, Hazel was kneeling over him with the cane's hidden blade, a 4-inch sliver of surgical steel her father had built into the shaft when she was 17, for reasons she'd only half believed until tonight, resting against the soft skin of his throat. "You assumed I was helpless," she said, and her voice was steady in a way that frightened even her. "Everyone always assumes that. It's the most useful mistake people make." The penthouse doors blew open 30 seconds later with a force that rattled the windows. Cassian came through them first, jacket gone, shirt torn at the shoulder, a weapon raised, and his face a mask of barely controlled violence. And then he saw her, saw the girl he'd spent a decade protecting kneeling on his own hardwood floor with a traitor pinned beneath a blade, utterly, terrifyingly composed. "He sold us out to Lowry," Hazel said without looking up. $2 million and the North End. The warehouse was the distraction. Marcus, behind Cassian, made a strangled sound. "Boss, she just..." Cassian lowered his weapon slowly, and something moved across his face that Hazel had never seen there before. Not shock exactly, but a kind of awe so total it looked almost like grief, as if he were mourning the version of her he'd spent 10 years believing in. "Take him downstairs," Cassian said finally, his voice rough. "He talks before he stops being useful to anyone." Marcus hauled Theo away, and then it was only the two of them in the wreckage of the evening, the city glittering silently 52 floors below. Cassian crossed the room and knelt in front of her, the way you'd kneel in front of something sacred. He reached out, and this time when his fingers found her scar, his hand was unsteady. "You let me believe you were helpless," he said. "You needed to believe it," Hazel said. "It made you careless about the right things." She set the cane down, the blade retracting with a quiet click, and let herself finally lean into his hand. "My father didn't raise a girl who needed protecting, Cassian. He raised someone who could survive whatever came looking for her. You just got to watch. I should have known." His thumb traced the scar one more time, slow, reverent. 10 years, and I never once considered that the thing I was protecting might be more dangerous than the thing I was protecting it from." "You weren't protecting me," Hazel said softly. "You were keeping me safe until I was ready. There's a difference." Outside, sirens rose somewhere in the distance. The sound. She would learn later of half of Desmond Lowry's organization coming apart in a single night, the consequence of a man discovering, too late, that the daughter he thought he could simply take had never once stopped being her father's most dangerous secret. Cassian Bray, who had built an empire on the principle that he trusted no one and forgave nothing, leaned forward and pressed his forehead to hers, and for the first time in 10 years of careful, guarded watching, let himself simply be still. "When this is over," he murmured, "you and I are going to have a very long conversation about what else your father taught you." "When this is over," Hazel said, and there was something almost like a smile in it now. "I'll consider telling you." Toronto didn't know it yet, but somewhere in a glass tower 52 floors above its rain-soaked streets, the city's most careful, most feared man had just discovered that the girl he'd spent a decade watching over had never once needed watching at all, and that the empire he ruled was about to belong just as much to her.